everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you my first Pat McGrath haul of the year. So I have here her new bronzer in the shade Nude Honey. I am super excited about this because, as you guys know, I love Pat McGrath. It's my favorite makeup brand, and I have pretty much all of her products, or at least all of her permanent line, and bronzers is definitely a category that we've been waiting for a very long time. And so finally I have the beautiful bronzer here. So for today's video, I'm going to demo this bronzer, give you guys a ton of comparison swatches, and I also actually have some of the other new releases from her. So I have Divine Rose 3 in this holiday set that she released previously. So that's this shade over here. I'll give you guys a demo and swatches of that. And then I did not pick up the quad, but I will try to recreate a look very similar to it using my existing Pat McGrath shadows. So definitely stay tuned for that. And finally, I am wearing the shade Nude Venus on my lips. And so if you're interested in those new lip products from her, this is what they will look like. So if you want to learn more about Pat McGrath's new bronze collection, then just stick around. So let's start, of course, with the bronzer. This is what the packaging looks like. And here are the ingredients in case you guys are curious. This has an 18-month shelf life, and let's open it up. So this is basically the exact same packaging that she has for her Divine blushes. As I mentioned, I got this in the shade Nude Honey. This has a beautiful crown embossment, which is different from the rose embossment of her blushes. And I picked up this shade, which is the second lightest shade, primarily because of its neutral undertone. So for context, on her website, she does provide recommendations for which shade of bronzer to get depending on your foundation shade. And I actually have her shade LM13 on my face today, along with my LM10 concealer from her. And so actually, based on that, I should be getting a much deeper bronzer. But because this was the only neutral undertone other than the deepest shade in the bronzer line, I decided to pick this up just because normally I do prefer more of a neutral bronze. But if I really love this formula, the Sephora VIB sale is going on right now, so I might consider picking up another shade. So without further ado, let's get to swatching this. So I always hate breaking the pattern, but here is what the bronzer looks like. It is very much a matte bronzer. Let's just put this on the back of my hand. So it looks pretty light on my skin tone, I would say that. You can see that has quite a neutral undertone to it, so not very orangey, definitely more of a peachy undertone. And actually, let me also swatch it on the inside of my arm where my skin tone's a little lighter, just so you can see that. So here it is on the inside of my arm, and here it is on more tanned skin. So hopefully the shade shows up well for me. It does look a little bit light in pan, but I have seen some reviews that have said it's very buildable, so let's try that out. So I'm going to try this with two brushes today. So on one side of my face, I'm going in with my Face Pro from Sonia G, and I'm just going to dip that generously and put that on my face. Well, that was really easy to blend out. Okay, I mean, this brush is also really nice, but wow, look at that. That was super easy. And for context, this is my bad cheek. This is my good cheek, and usually I have a lot more problem with bronzer on this side, but yeah, that was super easy. Wow. Okay, let's sweep this over my forehead as well. And I don't think I had to worry about the shade at all. I think you can definitely see it on my skin tone. It looks a lot deeper on the face, I would say, than it looked in pan. And let's just put some of that also on my jawline. And this is definitely a pretty matte formula on the skin as well. I mean, it doesn't look dry, but I don't think you really see any sheen from it either. So definitely very good as a bronzer. Now there is one shade in the line that does have some golden shimmer particles. So if you want something that's more of a glowy bronzer, that's more warming, then that might be a better shade. But I'm really glad I picked this one up because this is definitely the kind of bronzer I've been going for. Now on the other side of my face, I'm going in with my Niji Pro from Sonia G. This is more of a stiff brush, so I use it more with a stippling motion. So let's see how that looks, and that's going on beautifully. Okay, that's great. Wow. I'm very impressed with this formula so far. It's looking really nice, and I feel like this shade is very perfect for my tastes and my skin tone as well. I'm really interested in how the comparison swatches will look with this because I really like this shade so far. And then finally, since this is on the cooler side, I'm going in with my Detail Pro from Sonia G, and I'm going to use this as nose contour as well. I really like when bronzer can be used for all of these purposes, so that way I don't have to pull out multiple products. All right, so excellent first impression. Super excited about this bronzer. I mean, I'm a little bit biased here because I love Pat McGrath so much, but expectations for me were really high for this. So the fact that it's thus far looking so good to me is actually, I think, a really good sign, because usually when I have high expectations, they can be kind of hard to meet. Now, before we go in with all of the comparison swatches and stuff, let's finish off the rest of this look. So I have here the Divine Rose shade. So let me give you guys a swatch of that. So here is Divine Rose. You can see it's a pinky coral shade. Really cute, really pretty. In case you're curious how it compares with Divine Rose, the original, let me give you guys a swatch of that as well. So here is Divine Rose, definitely more cool toned and mauvey. And actually, since I have this open, let's also just compare it with Peony Rose. This is from the other holiday set. So Peony Rose is a little bit more hot pink. So here we have those comparisons, the bronzer, Divine Rose 3, Divine Rose 1, and Peony Rose. And Pat McGrath does have one of my all-time favorite blush formulas, so I very much can vouch for her formula. I have almost all of the shades in it. So let's take this on my Cheek Pro from Sonia G and just dab this on the face. This shade is in a demi-matte formula, meaning that it's not really going to have any shimmer particles in it, but it's also not going to be like a really flat matte. It'll be a little bit more satin. So here we have the shade on the face, really, really pretty. I think this is really beautiful for the spring going into summer months because it has that kind of coral warmth and redness to it, but still has some of that pink as well, which gives it more of a healthy vibe. Very, very pretty. And you can see that this shade, even though it's definitely more pigmented than Divine Rose 1, is still relatively buildable, so don't be scared of the fact that it's a bit deeper. But isn't that so pretty? Like, wow, look at that. Super, super cute. And I'm going a little overboard with blush today just so you guys can really see it on camera. But I love this formula and I love this shade. So, so pretty. So now let's get into duping the eyeshadow palette. So this is the Divine Bronze Luxe Quad Venusian Sunrise, which happens to actually be the name of one of her blushes as well, which looks totally different, but I guess she's just rolling with the Venusian Sunrise theme. So this is a really pretty quad, and I think if you've been looking for a more neutral palette from Pat McGrath, this is actually a really great option. Personally, I decided not to pick it up just because I have so many eyeshadows from Pat McGrath already. I own all of her Motherships, a lot of her quads, and all of her holiday palettes. And so that's why today I wanted to just revisit my existing collection instead of picking up this new quad. But let's try to see if we can find some similar shades. So first off, we have Nude Solaris. This looks to be kind of a champagne gold shade, so immediately I thought of the Skin Show shade from Bronze Seduction, which is one of her most popular palettes. I think honestly though, if you have any of her Motherships, the Skin Show shade will probably work from that. So let's go with this. And then next up we have Sunset Taupe. So this is kind of a rosy looking taupe shade. It's actually pretty neutral in undertone. So I immediately thought of this shade from her holiday palette, Celestial Nirvana. So this is called Desert Divinity. Let's swatch that right here. So I think that's kind of a decent dupe for this shade. And then we have Velvet Eclipse. So this is a really deep brown shade, almost a little bit of mahogany in it. So immediately again, I thought about in this palette, the dark brown shade over here. This one is called Nightfall. So let's swatch this. I think that kind of looks about the same. And part of also why I thought of the holiday palette is because the holiday palette is limited edition. I figure if there are shades that she really enjoyed, she would probably want to repurpose them for another palette. And so I think these look pretty similar to what she has in this quad. And then finally, she has a really beautiful, flaky, gilded glamour shade. So this looks really, really pretty. I think this one is, on the one hand, the shade that you probably have the most of if you have Pat McGrath palettes, but on the other hand, it might be kind of a different formulation in this palette. I immediately, though, thought of the Sublime palette in this flaky shade over here. As you can see, this is very high impact golden bronze. And I haven't used this shade in a while, so I thought it would be fun for today's look. So here is a close-up of my duped version of the quad. Hopefully this gives a relatively similar look to what we're seeing online. So today on the lids, I just have my Pat McGrath concealer as primer because I'm trying to keep everything in the Pat McGrath family. So let's go in now with that taupe shade on my Wayne Goss number 16 brush. I really enjoy this palette and especially this little quad over here because it's the perfect palette for traveling. It's cardboard, so you don't really have to worry about it being heavy or breaking. And this nice little neutral quad in the corner is just perfect for everyday makeup looks. You can really easily tone this down for kind of a very natural office look, but also glam it up. And then of course you have all of these fun colors as well. So I don't know if she's still selling this on her website, but if she is and you haven't picked it up, it's a really, really lovely palette. And because I like this quad so much, I do hope that this quad that she just released uses these shades because these are glorious shades. As you can see, they blend out like a dream, and this taupe shade can either be sheared out really nicely, as you can see kind of in the crease area, or built up for more depth. So it's very, very versatile. And in general, I would say Pat McGrath tends to lean more kind of warm toned and also more rosy for most of her shades. And so that's one thing I really liked about this little quad. It's one of the most neutral curations from Pat McGrath. So there we go. We have the taupe shade down. Next, with my Wayne Goss number 17 brush, I'm going into this deeper shade. And actually, let me bring you guys closer. Sorry, I forgot to do that earlier. Hopefully that helps with seeing what's going on. So I'm just gonna build out the outer corner to have some more depth here. And this shade really brings some nice dimension to the party. I always hate it when palettes don't have enough depth to give you that sort of smoky look, but this one definitely brings it. So now before going in with that Blitz Astral shade, I'm actually going to go in with my IntensifEYES Artistry wand from Pat McGrath because this particular shade is very, very flaky. I actually don't use this shade from Sublime very often because as beautiful as it is, it does tend to have a lot of fallout. So to try to mitigate that, I'm going to really apply a decent amount of this Artistry wand. And for context, if you guys aren't familiar with this product, it's basically like mixing liquid turned into a balm and then put into this stick component. And so if you have any flaky shadows where you really want them to stick to your lids, or you just want to amp up your shadows, this is a great product to look into. Now it is going to disturb your mattes underneath, so whenever I use this, I'm not too precious about my mattes because I'm gonna have to go back in later and kind of fix them. But it is a more convenient way of using mixing liquid. So now let's just go in with a finger and dab this on. And so I think you can see just how nicely that adhered. Usually this shadow in particular would just be flaking off my lids like crazy, but applied in this manner, it looks basically like I wetted it. Ooh, wow. Look at just how gilded that is. So pretty. I'm glad I'm breaking this out because it's been a while since I've used this palette. Always nice to have excuses to bring out my motherships. So there we are, really beautiful golden lids. So now for the lower lash line, I'm going to first go in with my Sonia G Soft Definer and back into this taupey shade and just kind of sweep this all over the lower lash line area. And then with my builder brush, I'm taking some of the deeper shade and just concentrating that on the outer portion. And then for the lower lash line shimmer, I'm actually going to go in with this shade from Bronze Seduction because I feel like it'll be a little bit easier to control than the other one, which is just very flaky. I would consider just putting some mixing liquid and kind of doing what I did on top, but I figure this will just be a little bit easier since I have Bronze Seduction out anyway. And then also just taking a little bit of this on that builder, I'm going to actually put this at the intersection of the previous bronzy shade and the matte shade just to try to smooth some of that transition area. Because when you use a really flaky shade, sometimes it's a very dramatic transition between the flaky shade and the mattes. And so I like there to just be more of a subtle transition. No harsh edges. And then finally, of course, we have this Skin Show shade. So let's put that in the inner corner and kind of sweep it over the inner 1/3 as well, just to add a little bit more light to that area. And then also dab this along the brow bone. So there we have it. This is my attempt at recreating the Bronze Luxe Quad. Let me know what you guys think. And here we have the final full face of the Bronze Luxe Collection look. So before I forget, let me also just show you guys how Nude Venus looks. So she keeps coming out with more versions of Nude Venus, but with this collection she had, I think, the gloss and the lip liner. So Nude Venus is a really pretty peachy, pinky shade with golden shimmer. For my skin tone, I do find this to be a little bit light just by itself, but paired with some lip liner, it looks really nice. So today I have it with my Structure lip liner, which is also from Pat McGrath, and you can see that it's a really pretty, kind of very everyday friendly lip color, and I think it goes really well with this entire look. I mean, all of these shades kind of have a little bit of that warm, sun-kissed look to them, so it's definitely a vibe. So now let's get into some comparison swatches. So again, let me go in with this bronzer and put a nice swatch of this right at the top of my arm. And the first bronzer I thought of when I saw the shade was Slip from M Cosmetics. This is also a fairly neutral toned bronzer, but interestingly, putting them side by side, I think you can see that Slip is a little bit less peachy in undertone in comparison to the Pat McGrath shade. They're definitely very similar in formulation though, like the formulas basically look the same, they kind of have the same finish, just a very subtle difference in undertone. Next, we have my trusty Romand bronzer. This is in the Walnut shade. Let's just take the deeper portion and put that down here. Okay, so this is definitely much cooler toned and more brown in comparison to the Pat McGrath, though it also has a fairly similar texture. So I would say the finish and texture of these three is all pretty similar. Next, we have Hoola from Benefit. Not really my favorite bronzer, but I keep this around for comparison swatch purposes. So this is also still a little bit more neutral in tone, a little bit less peachy than the Pat McGrath. It's kind of interesting doing these comparison swatches because I didn't think of the Pat McGrath as being super peachy, but I feel like it is compared to these other ones. The texture is quite similar to Hoola. I would say Hoola picks up a little bit more pigment-wise. It's a less dry formula, and so when you use Hoola, it will tend to be a little bit more pigmented on the cheeks. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of that. I find the Hoola can be a little bit patchy, whereas with these other formulas, the other three that I swatched, they build really nicely because it's more of that kind of dry powder that you can really control and apply sheer layers of. Now, the next bronzer I thought of is very different in finish. This is actually the Glowish powder from Huda Beauty, but I have this in shade 05 medium, and so I use this as a bronzer, and this is very luminous, and as you can see, it's also much warmer in tone than the Pat McGrath, but the depth level is fairly similar. All of these kind of have a similar depth so far. Next, we have the Filmstar Bronze and Glow from Charlotte Tilbury. This also has a little bit of shimmer in it, so the finish is quite different. But you can see this is definitely a lot lighter. In general, this formula is one of my lightest bronzers, and I use this a little bit more as a contour because it kind of just adds a subtle shadow to the face. Really nice formulation though, and even though it's very light, it actually does show up on your skin. Next up, we have my Gucci bronzer. This is one of my all-time favorite formulas. So let's swatch this. You can see this is where we start getting into slightly more pigmented formulas. I had to really build up some of these, but this is just one swatch of the Gucci. And this one is a little bit more cool toned actually than the Pat McGrath. This has much more of that kind of almost plummy undertone, whereas the Pat McGrath is a little bit more orangey. Next, we have the Victoria Beckham bronzer. I have this in shade 3. So there's two different sides to this. A cooler tone side, and ooh, this is a flaky formula, and a warmer toned side. So you can see that both of these sides are definitely more pigmented than the Pat McGrath, a lot more pigmented in fact. But I would say in terms of tone, it's kind of similar to the more cool toned of the Victoria Beckham. Next, we have the LYS bronzer. I have this in the shade Harmony, which is their medium shade. And let's just swatch that over here. This one is also quite pigmented straight from the swatch. A decent amount comes out. This one actually has a reasonably similar undertone, I would say, to the Pat McGrath, just much more pigmented. And then finally, I have Chantecaille's bronzer Goa. This is probably the coolest toned bronzer in my collection. And let's make some room for this one. So you can see this one also has a very different formulation, whereas these are much more powdery and dry. This one has more of a creamy formula to it. And yes, it is cooler toned than the rest of these. And here is a close-up of all of the bronzers. So we have Pat McGrath, M Cosmetics, Romand, Hoola, Huda Beauty, Gucci, Victoria Beckham, cooler and warmer toned, LYS, and Chantecaille. So considering that I've been primarily gravitating towards these bronzers up top, like the M Cosmetics one, recently, I am very glad that this new Pat McGrath bronzer kind of fits the vibe that I've been going for, which is more matte bronzers that have a bit more of a neutral undertone to them. And today's experience was really pleasant in terms of just how easy it was to use the bronzer all over my face. Basically every area was just super, super simple and fuss-free, very buildable, no patchiness. So I'm very pleased with how this went. Now, of course, this is just a first impression, so I can't say exactly how this will compare to all of my other bronzers. It is very similar to the M Cosmetics, so these two will kind of be duking it out in terms of the top place. But at least so far things are looking very promising, and I would say that if you are looking for a more neutral tone bronzer and you want one that's really easy to use and is fairly fuss-free, then I think the Pat McGrath one is really great to check out, especially right now with the sale going on. In terms of everything else on my face, I love the Divine Rose 3 blush. Would highly recommend if you like this color. In general, I love all of her blushes. Would highly recommend all of them. And then this eye look is really pretty as well. I'm glad I recreated it with my existing shades. Is this exactly what I see online? Maybe not totally, but I think this gives basically a very similar vibe. If this is the kind of look you enjoy and you don't have a lot of Pat McGrath shadows, I think this quad is a really good way of achieving that. And then Nude Venus is just a very pretty, very solid shade. And I love her lip liner and lip gloss formulas. So if you like the shade, then picking it up in her formulas is a good way to go. So that's it for today's video. I would love to hear in the comments if you guys are picking anything up from this bronze collection, and if so, I would love to hear your opinions as well. Especially with the bronzers, I was really uncertain which shade to pick up, so I would really love to hear how you guys have gotten along with that. If you've picked up one of her bronzers, what's your skin tone roughly and how does it look? Because if her bronzer is anything like her blush for me, there's a very decent chance I will continue picking up more shades. So I'm definitely curious to hear what your guys' experiences are. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!